Welcome to Tea Time with the Jackson Center. My name is Kristan McMahon, and I have the pleasure of serving as the president of the Robert H. Jackson Center in Jamestown, New York. We envision a world where the universal principles of equality, fairness, and justice prevail. 2021 is an important recognition year for Justice Jackson, international humanitarian law, and the Jackson Center itself. And during the course of this year, we will be celebrating the 80th anniversary of Justice Jackson's appointment to the Supreme Court, the 75th anniversary completion of the International Military Tribunal at Nuremberg and the birth of international humanitarian law, and the 20th anniversary of the Robert H. Jackson Center. All of those milestones and our planning to commemorate or celebrate them had us looking to the past to see how far we, the law, and the world have come. But we know we cannot simply rest on our laurels. So it also sparked conversation regarding where we are headed and how we get there. And that's part of the story as to how we got to our 2021 programming theme, The Work Left to Do. During this year, we are convening conversations about democracy, US and global institutions, human and civil rights, and equity. And we have structured our bi-monthly teas a little bit differently this year. Each month has a particular focus. And in September, we are looking at disability rights and disability justice. The first tea each month, which this is geared to provide you with an understanding of the work left to do to achieve equity or to make progress in this area. And the second tea each month is geared to showcase those who are actively doing the work to close those gaps. And in this tea, we have a little bit of both. So we hope each of these programs inspires you to have conversations with your friends, families, and colleagues, and to seek out ways to make change in your own communities. Today, I'm excited to be in conversation with Susan Henderson, the Executive Director, and Sivlia Yee, Senior Staff Attorney of the Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, which is a leading national civil rights law and policy center directed by individuals with disabilities and parents who have children with disabilities. DREDF's mission is to advance the civil and human rights of people with disabilities through legal advocacy, training, education, and public policy and legislative development. Susan and Silvia, thank you so much for joining me for tea today.
Thank you, Kristan.
Thanks for having us.
So I like to start each of these with what I consider a foundational question. And in this instance, obviously, it is, what do we mean when we say disability justice or disability rights? And I know you all think that, or you all explained to me that there's a difference between those two things. So Susan, I'm going to start with you on that question.
Sure. So hello, everybody. Thanks for having us. So DREDF, that's how you say our acronym and how we're fondly known, is a nonprofit disability civil rights organization. Our work is rooted in civil rights and the principle of non-discrimination and the rule of law. In the disability, among people with disabilities, among disabled people, there is a disability justice movement that is separate but complementary to the work that we do. And it's, you know, just like there's an environmental justice movement, there are differences. And I'm going to go ahead and let Silvia talk to you a little bit about those.
Thanks, Susan. So looking a little bit more closely at both civil rights and disability rights, the disability rights movement was conceived out of the civil rights movement, and an understanding of rights that stems from that, from Title VI, from Title IX, this idea of equality. But at the same time, there was also a growing disability rights movement just in the world that was really rebelling against the idea that a medical diagnosis determines your life and your future. So there were a lot of really good thinkers who made the distinction between a medical model of disability and a social model of disability. And the medical model defines disability primarily through diagnosis, through the medical symptoms and medical characteristics and a medical diagnosis that is located in the individual. The social model said, wait, that's not even half the story. Disability arises from the interaction between one's own diagnosis and needs, and the world around them. So the fact that we use stairs a lot, the fact that we expect people to be able to fill out their own forms and read print, the fact that we communicate primarily through spoken English in many of our interactions, those are the ways that we run the world, and that disadvantage people with disabilities in multiple ways. But it's not just the fact of a medical diagnosis. There is a lot more going on. So that began a lot of thinking around disability. And it was important because the definition of disability has always been an issue for law. And if you think about, I mean, the US has had existing benefits laws that are triggered by disability. Those usually run on the medical model. This was the idea of disability civil rights grew out of a whole different idea and a thought that, well, we needed something different, a different way to define disability, because people with disabilities are disadvantaged in the world, disadvantaged by laws, discriminated against, not just because they have a medical diagnosis, but because of that interaction as we look at the social model. So the Americans with Disabilities Act has a definition that is what is called 3 prongs. Then one is that you have a limitation on a major life activity, significant limitation on a major life activity. 2 is that you have a record of such a limitation, or 3, you're perceived as having such a limitation. And that 3rd prong is really trying to get at the social model. When other people, when your employers, when shopkeepers, when the world treats you as having a disability, then you have a disability. You are disadvantaged. You are discriminated against. So that is the link with civil rights. And then disability justice, maybe one way to think of it is as distinct from disability rights. You could see it similarly in when you had reproductive rights brought by feminists and many women who were demanding the right to reproductive access to reproductive controls, and then reproductive justice growing out of that, in which there was a greater attention and focus on the impact of reproductive laws on women of color, on socioeconomic people, women and families that had lower incomes and less access to medical care. Reproductive justice growing out of the reproductive rights movement is similar to reproductive justice, to disability justice, which grew out of a lot of thinking from people with disabilities of color, and who really focused on how those two things intersected and how both the disability rights movement and the world regarded people with disabilities of color, how those things interacted in their own lives. And so that it is a distinct movement. It's related, but it's rooted a lot more in a broader array, I think, of topics and interactions, reflecting the interests of people with color, with disabilities and their families, and the broader range of expression of social and cultural, economic and political power balances that they look at. So that's just distinguishing the two movements for you.
Well, no, and I think that's important. We've had, although we at the Jackson Center have assigned specific themes to each of these months under the Work Left to Do, we do have a lot of conversations about the intersectionality between the various things. There are very few things that are strictly a racial issue. There are very few things that are strictly a gender issue. There are very few things that are, well, and perhaps the better way of saying it, nearly everything is complicated by if you are more than one thing. So if you are a minority female who's also disabled, the laws and how you move through the world and the impact that the laws have on you is infinitely more complicated than if you are a white woman in moving through the world who's not disabled. So this is a very familiar conversation for our audience, this intersectionality. I think one of the things, so DREDF predates the ADA. And predates most of the disability related civil rights litigation in the US. And so I'm curious as to, why was DREDF established? And are we still discussing the same things that we were discussing when you all were founded? And Susan, I think I might start with you there since you have a long history with the organization.
Sure. We both, I mean, Silvia's, she's no spring chicken either. She started in 2000 with us. So we were, and Silvia alluded to this, she mentioned it, as exclusion from society came to be understood as a result of the barriers in the environment and the perceptions and attitudes towards disabled people. Disabled people themselves started to realize that these barriers were discrimination. It wasn't about them, it was about society. And this was, they were children of the civil rights movement. It opened their eyes. So people with physical and cognitive disabilities realized that the things they were facing, exclusion and institutionalization, weren't an inevitable part of being disabled. Think about it, people who used mobility devices back in the 70s couldn't get on buses or attend schools that had steps or, and didn't have elevators. People who are deaf couldn't use telephones to talk to their friends and family or businesses. So, there was this recognition that it was about the built environment and attitudes. And so people, really smart people, started DREDF and other organizations close to around the same time. We were basically the legal arm of what was known as the independent living movement, that recognition that, people with disabilities could live independently with supports in the community. And we modeled ourselves after those great civil rights organizations that came before us, like the NAACP Legal Defense Fund, MALDEF, the now Legal Defense Fund. So, that's why we came about.
That's great. And so has the conversation changed? Let me rephrase this. My hope is the conversation has changed since this first started. And even on your website, looking through the cases that DREDF has been involved in, 20 or so years ago, it seemed to be still pretty basic. People need access to things. How are we getting them access to things? And I'm sure that there is still some of that now, but is the conversation and are the challenges now more nuanced? Or are we really still dealing a lot with some of the same things that DREDF has been dealing with all along?
So, Silvia, do you want
to? Sure. I mean, that's a really interesting question that made us reflect a lot. Both Susan and I have done some work internationally on disability rights. Susan has worked in Vietnam and in Kenya, and I've worked in Guatemala and Mexico, helping to strengthen. It was State Department funded work to strengthen disability rights movements in those countries, and it was really interesting to work. And going to places like that and thinking through, what are people with disabilities facing? There is a difference. It's encouraging to see people with disabilities banded together and trying to work in the community, but there are still some really, really basic things. There is no right of children with disabilities to attend school. You have people who parents who just bring their children to school, and the school says no, and that's it. How you fight that is really, really hard. People with their service animals can't get into establishments. Still basic inaccessibility in buildings, in public services, on sidewalks. So that I think that you can see changes, physical changes, and lots of attitudinal changes. Japan is a country that is often beautifully physically accessible, but you do not see people with disabilities on the street and out and around, in large part because of a cultural attitude toward disability. If you have someone with disabilities in the family, you don't necessarily bring them out in public. So I think that a lot of that has changed in the US. But on the other hand, I'm thinking of some of the cases I work on, and some of them are still really, really basic. We have brought a case with co-counsel against Medi-Cal, against the Medicaid agency in California, and it's to provide people who are blind and Medi-Cal beneficiaries, Medicaid beneficiaries, with communications and notices in alternate formats, because they're still being sent print letters. And you kind of think, well, that seems like we should have gone past that in many ways, right? And in other ways, yeah, there is a lot more nuance, a more sophisticated understanding. We're looking at changes in cases. For instance, the right to be out in the community, the right to be integrated in society. And so one of our cases is looking at how a county cycles people through, individuals who are homeless, perhaps cycles them through temporarily being in a psychiatric hospital, then out in the streets, and then in jail. And then you can sort of cycle through over and over. And these are individuals who are not getting the services that they need, that are community-based, that will actually help them break out of this cycle. And that is a disability rights issue, along with lots of other intersecting things. So
I feel like the addition of mental health into the disability conversation is also a much more recent, from an external viewpoint, certainly as someone who is not working in this space with any regularity. To me, that feels like a newer element of when we're talking about disability, that mental capabilities previously were not strongly considered. It was what people were focused on was more physical disability or that sort of impairment. Is that, from an external perspective, recognizing that may not at all be accurate, and by all means tell me I'm wrong, because that's totally fine. But is that true? Is the mental health, mental ability conversation a more recent addition to this, or has that really, for people in this space, has that been there all along? Susan, maybe that's a good place for you to start.
So from my experience, it's been there all along. I think that there have certainly been survivors of psychiatric institutionalization who have been very active since the 70s and 80s. There's organizations, legal organizations, the Bazelon Center on Mental Health Law, that has been around for 30 years, I believe, too, as long as DREDF. I think that what happens is that certain cases, certain issues hit the media and become more, and so it becomes more part of what we see every day. But the work has been going on for a long time, but it's also, some things, the issues are more societal and difficult to deal with. So people who are homeless also are often people who have mental illness. And so you've got, all of the, a lot of eyes on how to manage, how to make sure people have their rights are protected, and but also make sure that society, the community, is also, in a place where there aren't homeless people. I don't know how to put it. Silvia can talk much more clearly about this, but yeah, I think it's always been there. I think it's just there's points in times when it becomes more obvious to the general public.
Well, and I think that, and Silvia, I'll turn to you in a second. I think that what do I want to call it, environmental impact or environmental surroundings also plays a large part into very, very few of these challenges or questions have a one way to attack it. And so most of them require some sort of, whether it's global shift in thinking or community shift in how problems are addressed. That a lot of these conversations we've been having, it's, there's not just one path that you move forward on for this. There's usually, you need to bring in inputs from a number of areas in order to actually move towards a solution. more so than just addressing this particular instance of something. Sylvia, I see you nodding your head. So what would you like to add?
No, I was just thinking that I think the way that many of us recognize discrimination around us or in ourselves is through this analysis of, well, like people shouldn't be treated differently. And so we tend to, I think, and the law does this too, look for similarities, right? Oh, well, that the woman who is Black is being discriminated against because we're similar in so many ways, but they're treating her differently, right? We think similarly. We've got similar physical abilities. We've got, we even have the same height and weight or whatever, right? And then with physical disabilities, perhaps it's easier to sort of make that leap. It's, oh, that person uses a wheelchair, but in other ways, they're very, very similar. They went to school with me. They did, I think it has been harder for a lot of people, and myself included, in many ways, to think, well, that person thinks differently, or they're, as the phrase of neurologically atypical, right, is out now. And it's taken longer, I think, for people with mental health disabilities to really push across this fact that they are being discriminated against, that the huge mental and the huge social stigma that we attach to mental disability is unjustified. And that all of us actually, we do not all think the same. We do not have the same abilities. And that's really important. It's important for how we work as a society. It's important even for how boardrooms work, if you look at some of the latest research. And it needed to reach a point in the US of a certain consciousness raising, general consciousness raising, I think, before we became aware enough of mental health disabilities, of how so many people have mental health disabilities or some degree of that, and how we need to accommodate one another and figure out how to work together anyway.
So your comments actually, so we've received 2 questions so far, and your comments kind of touch on both of them. So I'm gonna ask them now. So we have a question from CJ about how can bipolar diagnosis be differentiated from other types of mental illness from a legal perspective? And Sylvia, I think I might start with you on that one.
Well, different. I'm not. I think I wouldn't mind a little clarification on why the differentiation. Like, is a differentiation desired? I think it is recognized. It certainly would be recognized under the ADA that it can be a limitation on major life activities. So it wouldn't necessarily be treated differently under the law as something that either requires accommodation from an employee or a reasonable modification from government services or so forth.
And I'll ask CJ to perhaps clarify his question to give you the context you need.
Okay.
And then the second question from Emily is, and you both touched on this actually, when it comes to mental illness and disabilities, there's still so many people who don't know that they fall under or could get help from the ADA or one of the related laws. So how do we help? And this is actually a very broad question, so you should be able to answer it in 5 minutes. That's no problem. How do we help end the stigma behind mental illness and disabilities and allow for people, or to empower people, to get the help that they need from the ADA or the related laws? Susan or Sylvia, who would like to start with that one?
So I'll just talk about this as an employer, or as a, or put my, step into an employer hat. Like, I believe that in a workplace, employers have somewhat of an obligation that if they see, to accommodate people, to bring up accommodation if they see people struggling for whatever reason. It's not like to ignore that somebody may have any type of disability that's getting in the way of being able to do their job. We often think, oh, it might be that it's the employee's job, it's the employee's duty to approach me to ask for an accommodation. But if employers know that there may be a disability, I think that there is something of a, to approach and say, is there an accommodation that we can provide? Do you need an accommodation? And I think that the stigma that surrounds disability and mental illness is so great that gets in the way of having those conversations. But I always often think, what's better, letting somebody lose their job and their livelihood, and because you don't want to because you're afraid to bring up the topic of disability. I think about youth and youth going through school, and schools in education, schools have a responsibility to identify children with disabilities, and that includes children with mental illness. And so hopefully that need to start doing that when they're younger helps, is helping drive this recognition that, that mental health is a disability that needs to be accommodated throughout the lifespan. And that can start in school, and the person, the student, can also take that into their adulthood and their, post 12th grade, post K-12, and ask for accommodations without feeling the stigma that has so long been a part of who we are. So that's how I feel. That's how I see it.
So what I wonder is, and I'm going to, this also seems like sort of perhaps a great place to get into some of the policy work that you all have been doing, because this feels like a natural connection to me. And we have used this word, all of us, multiple times in this conversation so far, and that's the word accommodation. And it's something I've been thinking about recently of, is that the right lens? Like, are we doing ourselves a disservice by already innately categorizing something as normal and something else is needing to be accommodated? And if that is the case, what lens should we be using? And so, yeah, I think I'm going to start with you on that one.
Okay. This is a really interesting question. I think it's a really interesting question for lawyers as well, and for people who do policy work and law. I mean, the law doesn't like ambiguity, right? The law likes bright lines. You either have a right to an accommodation or you don't have a right to an accommodation. And because of that, and it's a new thing anyway, this is one of the new concepts in the ADA as distinct from earlier civil rights laws, because you had less of that, or none of that really when you're talking about race. The idea was that you're treating someone badly because of their color or their ethnicity or their gender, right? So stop doing it. Here, it's like a person with a disability can do many, many things and can do the job, but they need a level playing field. So you owe them a change. So that was a new concept in civil rights. But if you're going to put an obligation on a covered entity, then you need to be very clear about when that occurs. Someone has to have a disability, and it's defined. I think as we sort of grow as a society, we recognize that there are many people have degrees of need for something to be a little bit different. And the mental health example that you brought up is very interesting, because as Susan was saying, I mean, physical disabilities change as well. They certainly change over time, but mental health also, perhaps even more so, changes over time and with circumstances, right? And this idea that recognizing that and providing accommodations or modifications of how we treat one another in the workplace or in school or even in our day-to-day interactions can have an impact, can help or hurt someone as they go through life with a disability or with maybe something that doesn't rise to the level of a legal disability, but could arise to it if it's untreated, if it's exacerbated in some way. I think that's, I mean, recognizing what you're saying, that individualized attention is really the ideal of a society, right? Or certainly is the ideal in education, and is important. But legally, it's really hard to say that everyone has a right to be accommodated or everyone has a right to be treated individually. I do think it's also helpful, though, to think that people aren't problems to be put away. And that was the thing with institutions, right? Oh, you have a disability. You don't function well in society. You can be put away here and taken care of in this nice place in the rural, in the wilds or something. Yeah. But that doesn't, I mean, we think it didn't work when we thought people with disabilities were just a little small group. And it certainly doesn't work as we begin to recognize that many, many, many of us have disabilities, even with a legal definition. Was it 60 million is the estimate now? It's not a group you can pack away. And they're also people we love and our families, colleagues we care for, et cetera. We can't just get rid of the problem. So we all have a stake in figuring out how to accommodate one another. And I'm not talking legally anymore. I'm talking about from a policy and from a human point of view.
Makes sense. Susan, is there anything you'd like to add there?
Yeah, I mean, in there's a concept of universal design, and it started out in the built environment, like building things, designing things, so they can be used by people with a wide range of functional needs or limitations. And I'm sitting in a building right now that it is built with the principles of universal design. And that universal design has broadened to things like learning and, product design as opposed to just, physical building design. So I think that to the extent possible, we should, design things, including laws and policies that are universal. It's not going to catch everything, but I think, and it's not a legal concept, at least not in the United States at this point, but I think that it's a good way to think about accommodations. Like when we, for instance, when we do online presentations, when we have webinars, we will automatically have a real-time captioner and an ASL interpreter, because that, we're a disability rights organization. And so, but the law says, you can ask, you can say, if you need an accommodation, like a real-time captioner or an ASL interpreter, let us know, and we will provide that. So, so there's the difference between sort of a universal approach and the legal approach.
That makes sense. Well, so in terms of when new laws in the work, and Susan, to piggyback off what you just said, and I think I was mostly focused on healthcare laws when I was originally thinking about this question, because that seems like a place where this comes in, but it's it is much broader than that. From your policy work, what are you paying attention to in those laws when you decide, oh, DREDF needs to insert itself here because they didn't think about this, or perhaps they don't realize that the way they have written this will negatively impact this population because it's just not part of their mindset. So what do you look for when new laws are being discussed to decide we need to put some of our muscle into this?
Silvia does that all the time.
Well, I think a fair amount of the time, the laws that I'm reviewing or I'm asked to review are specific to disability. So for those, I'd look perhaps for unintended consequences, and yes, and for inclusion across a range of disabilities. I'm trying to think of some really concrete examples, either in state or in federal laws. Sometimes laws come down that are for like a specific group. Sometimes there are laws that are specific to older people, let's say. And then it's just making sure. So for example, looking at that and making sure that there are younger people with disabilities who receive Medicare because there has been an assessment that they have difficulty being employed, right? So does that include, is it inclusive of that? This is not an example of a new law coming up, but I mean, it's interesting that, let's say, Medicare generally doesn't cover birth control. It just doesn't. It was a program designed for people who are people who are retired. That was sort of how it was conceived, right? That wasn't a pun, but anyway. Um, so unless I think there's an exception if a birth control medication can be used for another medical purpose, and then it might be covered because of that other purpose. But you don't get birth control as birth control. But there are younger people and younger women who are on Medicare who could have children and who are just paying out of pocket for these things because it's not covered. And so that's an interesting, I think, the way that laws are designed originally and over time don't account necessarily for people with disabilities who are covered by the law. And there are lots of unintended consequences along those lines with new laws that are created. There are a lot of laws going around now and regulations and policies around home and community-based services. And a lot of people who receive home and community-based services are older people who need care in their homes and who are lower income. And a lot are people with disabilities as well who can be younger. And then there are also people with disabilities who are aging, and their disabilities can grow worse over time, or they can acquire new disabilities. So that's a group that's in there and is not always explicitly thought of when you're writing laws and you're thinking, oh, home and community-based services, who needs them? Is it a constant need? How does the need change? What do we need to be thinking of?
Well, and that makes sense to me. And especially I'm going to bring up COVID now with the conversations that have been going on about long COVID. And, we don't really know what that looks like and what are the health ramifications that may be long-term. Is that factoring into these conversations now as well? Is long COVID seen as a potential disability or a disability?
Yes, I think long COVID could absolutely be potentially a disability. And, there are different sets of laws that are invoked by that. There are sort of disability insurance laws, which are not disability rights exactly, but they're income replacement and they're important. Disability rights, and yes, long COVID could rise because of the impact on major life activities. I think that that's something that a number of disability rights advocates are working on. And I think there also needs to be a very concrete connection with individuals who have long-term chronic conditions that are not COVID, because I think it's really been hard. We have a healthcare system that focuses on acute healthcare needs and on restoring people to the way they were before there was an accident and the idea, it's not a system that deals so well with people with long-term conditions, long-term pain, long-term functional impairments or limitations. It's not a system that deals well with the fact that these are people who are around, who still want to participate in life, obviously, who want to be in their communities, who can work with accommodations, or who can work to a degree. Our benefits in healthcare system is very sort of clear cut in terms of like, well, you totally can't work, or you can work, right? One or the other. And so this kind of reconfiguration of how we work and provide supports and services to people with long-term chronic conditions just really needs to be reconsidered and reconfigured, both for people with long-haul COVID and for anyone with long-term disabilities and conditions.
Well, and Susan, I'm going to ask you this question because what that also brought to mind is there have been a lot of articles recently about the number of accommodations that have just needed to be made over the last 18 months in order for workforces to continue to do their jobs, and how many of those are things that people in the disabled community have been asking for a very long time. And that sort of flexibility, the work from home, the various equipment, whatever it is. And now, I think if anything, the last 18 months have shown us these accommodations are certainly possible. And so how do we go about making that more regular, more, it's not a question of you have to be in the office. It's, you can do your job from anywhere. And if your particular disability makes it easier for you to do it from home, then that shouldn't really be seen as an accommodation. It's like, yeah, we know how to do this. So any thoughts on how some of the accommodations that have happened over the last 18 months hopefully become permanent?
There certainly is Zoom. Everything has made it very clear that we can do work from home, and that when somebody, not everybody has a job that can be done from home. So let's just put that on the table first. If you're a clerk at Safeway, you're going to need to be at the cash register. At least right now, we haven't figured that one out. But I think that there's a growing awareness. I think that we can see that from some of the huge tech companies who are building remote work platforms and policies. I think that I think a lot of employers still need to figure this out, because the idea that, oh, we just need to go back to the way it was isn't being very thoughtful. I can see that there is a need. There's a need to balance both what disabled people need, what employers need, what our families need. I mean, it's not just people with disabilities who have found remote work beneficial. Parents who had childcare issues. There's all sorts of things that all sorts of people and jobs and employers who will benefit if we're flexible in our working environment and how it moves forward. And I know that they're not necessarily simple, quick answers, because I think goes back to that it's individualized for a business or an organization how it's going to work. But I think that the one really obvious thing is that it can work in many, many, many situations. And since it is beneficial, we know that people with disabilities can do work more easily from their homes, and people who have not been able to go to a place can work from their home. And I think that that's become very obvious, and I just hope that employers in general recognize that, instead of just that we're going back to normal. We're going back to what we thought of as normal before.
Gotcha. All right, a reminder to our audience, if you have questions, please feel free to ask them at any time. I do want to ask you both, is there something from a policy or advocacy work that you're doing right now that you would like to highlight? Is there some way you're hoping to shape the law? And if so, what is that? And Silvia, that feels like a question for you.
I think, like many disability advocacy organizations, we have been working a lot on the Better Care, Better Jobs Act, and the sort of that federal funding and infrastructure that would allow an expansion of home and community-based services in states and across the country. There are thousands and thousands of people with disabilities who are on waiting lists for home and community-based services. Older people, younger people who do not want to enter institutional care, and certainly understandably so in the age of COVID and pandemics, who can be part of their communities, stay part of their communities if they receive home and community-based services. There are people who are aging who are going to need home and community services, like our parents, maybe us, right? Spouses, and who need home and community-based services as we age into disability or different disabilities. This is something that the U.S. has really been successful at avoiding for a long time. But it needs to be confronted. And as part of that as well, the people who provide home and community-based services are predominantly women and women of color and low income. And the idea of sort of building real careers, much better respected jobs, and recognizing the skill that goes into the work is equally part of a systemic change that needs funding and attention and thought and lots of policy. So I think that's just one thing I would love to draw everyone's attention to, is kind of supporting that as part of the federal proposals that are coming forward, and that skimping on that now will have very, very significant consequences for this country over the next few years.
That makes sense. And I don't know if this is really an accurate statistic, but what I have in my head is that at some point in the course of a lifetime, the vast majority of us will experience some type of disability, whether it is temporary or permanent, and that could be everything from, I broke my leg when I was 12 to I had Guillain-Barré, in my 30s. So, there's a variety of things. And so it feels as if, to your point, that we've long been perhaps not addressing or in denial about, it's something that's going to impact all of us likely at some point.
Right. Absolutely. You or someone you love who has that need, and then suddenly you have to be going part-time because you need to give care to your child or your spouse or your parent.
Okay. Well, and I alluded to this question a little bit at the beginning, that it feels as if, and certainly a lot of the work that DREDF does is also on the legal advocacy side too, and filing amicus briefs and regular briefs for the non-lawyers in our audience. And that it feels to me, at least looking through your website, that those lawsuits are becoming a little more nuanced. Sylvia, you mentioned there are still those basic access challenges, but it's now there seem to be a lot of this minority student who is also disabled had a disproportionate impact, or someone reacted very differently to him or her in an education setting or even in an incarceration setting than they might otherwise have. And so I also want to just see from a legal perspective, and from a we talk a lot about how most lawsuits come about because someone is trying to change the law, or how it's more, I guess, how it's enforced, or how it's interpreted. And so to see if there are particular cases that you all are involved in at the moment that you think are moving this in a direction that the law should be.
One of the cases that we've been working on for a while involves a 7 or 8 year old. At the time, he was 7 or 8, a Black child with disabilities in Moreno Valley here in California, the Moreno Valley School District, who is handcuffed repeatedly by law enforcement. It was called at the school. Probably many of us have seen kids who won't do what we want them to do. Right? And it can be our own children. Right? But the thought of a 7 or 8 year old being repeatedly handcuffed is just hard. I think we do, in cases like that, see some pretty nuanced interactions between racism, color, disability, and how they interact and how they interact in schools in particular. So yeah, in many ways, I think we are seeing more nuance, at least more recognition that how people are treated reflects a number of factors. And the law needs to sort of catch up with that in some ways, because the law tends to be specific, right? You were treated badly because of disability. You were treated badly because of race. And it has less, it doesn't really recognize that the way you were perceived is on a number of levels. The non-discrimination provision in the Affordable Care Act has become very significant because it applies to healthcare, which specifically to healthcare, which has been a really hard area to crack, a hard nut to crack, if you wanted to say, with regard to non-discrimination. And because it potentially, because it incorporates by reference 4 different civil rights laws, could see it as it's a doorway potentially to recognizing how those four bases of discrimination, race and ethnicity, gender, disability, and age, can interact, and especially can interact in healthcare. So that's a nuance that I think is really important.
Yeah, no, that's great that that intersectionality is finding a home, at least in the healthcare world at the moment, or at least perhaps the intersectional conversations are starting to find a home, if not the intersectionality itself. All right, Susan, I'm going to ask you, as the executive director of DREDF, what do you wish people were paying more attention to in this space that you think is something most of us aren't even aware of yet?
I work a lot with we have an education advocacy unit, and I work a lot with the really brilliant education advocates there in there. And I look at data a lot about what's happening in schools, and I think one of the things that I'd like people to know about is the ongoing segregation of students with disabilities in school, and it's disproportionate for disabled students of color. So I think that's an issue. I mean, there are still what are referred to as special day classes for disabled children, and they're often routed into those, pushed into those classes with no non-disabled peers, because schools still find it difficult or challenging for them to push services into general education classrooms. But segregation is not equal, and there are separate schools. There's still separate schools, and in some places, New York City has a huge, completely segregated school district within its own school district, where most of their children with disabilities go. So I think that ongoing segregation is something I would like people to be more attuned to, and figuring out how to ending that. That's my highlight for what I'd like to draw attention to.
Absolutely. And Silvia, what do you wish people were paying more attention to?
I think it's actually very similar. That mine just tends to have the healthcare spin. It was brought to my attention again recently that nursing homes are a form of treatment, right? That nursing homes are healthcare. We just think of it as like healthcare for a specialized group of people that need to be a part. So as long as we don't have like fully accessible community-based healthcare and mental health treatment, I'm including in that, we're going to have segregation. Because if you can't get what you need in the community, there is nowhere else to go except something separate. And that's, I would love people to think that through more.
This may be, let me know if this is a redundant question, in case I'm just asking the same thing two ways. But I'm also wondering, and Susan, again, I will start with you, is what do you see as some of the biggest priorities to balance the disability rights scales, to make sure that we're working towards disability justice? What are some of the biggest things we need to be working on or thinking about to close some of those equity gaps, to close some of those civil rights gaps?
The human infrastructure bill has billions of dollars in it to fund home and community-based services, which would help put an end to wait lists for people to get those community-based services, and not be shuttled into segregated nursing homes or other institutions. So that's one. I think that having those billions of dollars in the bill is a huge step forward. We haven't seen that. So if we can keep it in there, that's great. I mean, in one sense, it's the same, it's there with funding for childcare and hoping to, cap childcare at 7% of people's income, household income. I think, they're the same, not having supports for your child with a disability or your parent with a disability or for yourself prevents people from entering the workforce. They're the same kinds of issues that women face with childcare, that somebody needs, if you can't afford childcare, you can't go to work. So there's similar issues. I think that's that. And the other thing is, in many states, there's people with disabilities, primarily people with intellectual disabilities, are often put to work in what we called sheltered workshops that then pay a sub-minimum wage, a very, very, very sub-minimum wage, like dollars a day. And there different places around the country have made it unlawful to pay sub-minimum wages. In California, there's a bill that we're hoping will pass. It needs to be passed and be signed by the governor this month to end the practice of being able to pay people with disabilities a sub-minimum wage. So those are two bright spots on the horizon.
Well, and so we just got a question from Helena that sort of ties into both of these. So she wondered if in the effort to address the segregation of disabled students that Silvia was speaking about, is there also a concern that sometimes students are misdiagnosed because it's an attempt to avoid dealing with the issues of poverty or the issues of some other environmental thing that might actually be impacting this student? Is a mental health disability almost at that point sort of an easy way to separate this so you don't have to deal with the underlying issues? Sylvia, I think I might address that question to you.
Oh, sure. And I'm sorry, my device went blank.
No worries. We rolled with it. No worries.
Yeah. Susan can speak a lot to this as well, but I think there is a lot of, the misdiagnosis it does occur, and it can occur around the kind of diagnosis that's made too. So for sometimes with students of color or with others who have behavioral, it becomes a mental health disability or a behavioral disability, a disability with a lot of behavioral manifestations. But it's a diagnosis that's made that recognizes less the responsibility to provide services and supports for those behavioral issues. The severity of it, that makes it easier to segregate a child, as opposed to they can be mainstreamed or fully included, but you have to provide the appropriate services and supports. You have to put in the diagnosis, you have to put in the analysis, you have to put in the expert interventions. So that does happen. Susan, did you have?
Yeah.
No, I think that's it. I think a lot of times children will be sent to a segregated setting that's specifically for children with mental health disabilities, instead of looking at the whole child and figuring out what are the triggers for the behavior, what are the interventions for the behavior, what are the things that we can do to make sure the student stays at school. Because often once you're especially sent to an off-site segregated setting, you're not coming back. It's difficult to get back into the general ed classroom. And we do see disproportionate misclassification of students based on color, for sure.
Right.
And the system has evolved. I mean, it used to be a time when a child was put into special ed to get them out of the classroom, period. And so special ed got a really bad name, and parents no, I don't want my child to be have special ed because that means they're going to the basement. We've hopefully, in most places we've moved beyond that, but we still have ways to go.
Okay.
And I was just going to point out, I think a lot with parents who don't speak English isn't their first language, who are from other countries and who are, busy trying to survive. This can also be a big issue, because the individuals with disabilities Education Act is an amazing law in many ways, but it does place a lot of responsibility and rights with parents and families. And if you're not able to read through all of the to fully understand your rights and the pages of text and follow up with all the scheduling and the meetings, it becomes really hard.
Yes, that would be a daunting task in English alone, let alone trying to navigate that in another language as well. All right, so we're at 4 o'clock. So I'm going to quickly ask our lightning round because I love these questions and I can't not have you answer them. So Susan, I'm going to start with you. What progress do you hope to see in the next year?
I would say I'd like to see that the law in California on ending subminimum wage pass, and also the human infrastructure bill keep billions of dollars in there for home and community-based services.
Okay, perfect. And Silvia, same question for you.
I'd like to see a lot of these changes are rigid. I would like to see people with disabilities being consulted about what they want. I mean, it's a really basic thing, but with regard to laws, with regard to policies, government committees, businesses. I would like to see some media. I'd love to see people consulted about, people with disabilities consulted about what they want to see in media, how they want to be seen in media, and so forth.
Yeah, no, that's great. I know that there's a common phrase in many civil rights that nothing about us without us, and that's certainly an element of that. We've also had a lot of conversations this year of justices, however the community defines justice. So it can't be a top-down imposition of this is what we think justice looks like for you, or this is what we think rights look like for you. It's much more a community and organic bubbling up of that information and those issues. All right, then Silvia, I'm going to start this question with you. What gives you hope that progress will be made?
I know this is a cliche thing, but I am encouraged when I see youth. I see a lot of I see lawyers with disabilities who don't necessarily want to go into civil rights or disability rights. They just want to do other areas of law, which is, sometimes you kind of like, oh, we need to come and fight with us. But at the same time, it's, well, you feel you have the freedom to do whatever it is you want to do and to follow your interests, and to exactly that, not to have your future determined by the fact that you are a person with a disability.
All right, Susan, same question for you. What gives you hope that progress will be made in the next year?
I think that our movement, our organizations, other organizations are becoming more diverse. Intersectionality has been recognized, and that the diversity of the movement is only growing our community. And so that gives me hope.
Perfect. And since you touched on this, I'm going to start with you for this question. Who else is doing good work to make progress?
Well, lots of other disability organizations out there, our colleagues in Washington and in California and throughout the states. We're really, really fortunate to have leaders in the Senate like Senator Duckworth and Bob Casey. So that's great. And I have to say, DREDF's Disability in Media Alliance Project is doing really good work and having an impact pretty quickly. So those are the things.
That's wonderful. This is absolutely a place for shameless self-promotion. So no worries about that at all. Silvia, for you, who else is doing good work?
There are filmmakers out there, like James Brecht, who did Crip Camp, who are, it's great to see that out there. I think, any person with a disability is sort of out there, who has relationships that they're open with, transparent about who they are, what they need. It's such a long battle to change hearts and minds, and ultimately hearts and minds are great, but you also need a law and policy too. So everything working together. And it's hard when you're not an extrovert.
But I don't think introversion is considered a disability yet, though.
It's not. But Yeah.
And okay, and then our final lightning round question is, we'd like to leave our audience with suggestions of if they would like to do more education for themselves. Who would you recommend that they be reading or listening to, or podcasts, or even just people who are thinking deep thoughts in this space?
So there's been a lot in the last few years of media and disability, media writ large. Judy Heumann, who's been sort of one of the godmothers of the disability rights and independent living movement, who's on our board, wrote a biography or memoir called The Human Perspective. It's an easy read, check it out. Alice Wong, who is known as her Twitter name is SF Direwolf. I'd follow her because she's also got a book out, and there's just, and you can, if you follow Alice, you will find she'll list authors and podcasts and things like that. I think if you look to about the healthcare issues on Vimeo or YouTube, look at DREDF's channels and the healthcare stories, and you can hear people with disabilities telling about their experiences with medicine. And so it'll make it very clear the kind of discrimination that's been happening. And if you want to know more about disability justice, if you just Google disability justice and the name Patty Byrne, Berne, you'll find some really great writing about disability justice and its differences with disability rights.
Yes, and this amazing arts organization called Sin Invalides, if I'm remembering correctly.
Patty's part of Sin's Invalid. And then and of course Crip Camp, the documentary that it's on Netflix that Silvia just mentioned by Jim Lebrecht.
Silvia, anybody you'd like to add to this?
I'm going to pop into the future in a bit and say the Center for Genetics and Society does a lot of interesting work around genetic testing and in vitro fertilization that looks at reproductive justice, but also looks at the issues of eugenics and the ties with genetic testing for disability and race and socioeconomic justice.
Got it. Perfect. Okay. So I would like to thank you both and thank our audience for joining us for tea today. A couple of upcoming program notes. So our audience can mark their calendars, and these are all free programs. So join us again in 2 weeks on September 23rd at 3 p.m. Eastern for our next tea time as we continue to explore issues of disability rights and disability justice. Our guests will be Marcy Roth and Dawn Skaggs from the World Institute on Disability. And then just from a historic programming note, to commemorate the end of the IMT at Nuremberg 75th anniversary, we are offering 2 webinars in partnership with the International Nuremberg Principles Academy, one on September 30th and one on October 1st, which are the dates that the verdicts and the sentences were read. So on September 30th, the panel of Fatou Bensouda, who's the former prosecutor for the International Criminal Court, David Crane, who's the former prosecutor of the Special Court for Sierra Leone, and Richard Goldstone, who was the first chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Tribunals for the former Yugoslavia and Rwanda, will be our panelists, and that will be moderated by Stephen Rapp, who is the former U.S. ambassador at large for war crimes issues. And they'll be talking about the legal aspects of the Nuremberg judgment as precedent for all of these international criminal courts that have followed. And then on October 1st, the panel, which has a lot of people, so I will not name them all, will discuss the legal implications of the Nuremberg judgment for prosecutors today. And you can find more information and the registration link on our website, roberthjackson.org. And Susan and Silvia, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing your thoughts. We truly appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you.